Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from, because this is a hybrid event. My name is Helen Crawley. I'm Head of Equitable Development and Migration at UNU-CPR here in New York, but also Director of the MIDEC Hub. I'd really like to welcome warmly all of you who are here with us in the room in New York, and also those of you who are joining us online from around the world, to this second UNU-CPR Migration Policy Roundtable, which will be focusing on the challenges of migration and decent work in the context specifically of the Global South. Just a few words of introduction about the event and the aims and the format to give you a sense of our direction and travel. You have in front of you, I think, a concept note just setting out some of the ideas, and also you should have a participants list as well. As you know, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment and decent work is really central to the deliveries of the SDGs, and it's reflected, of course, in SDG 8. Despite this, roughly half of the world's population still lives on the equivalent of about $2 a day, and in far too many places, having a decent job doesn't necessarily guarantee the ability to escape from poverty. This is particularly a problem for young people ages 15 to 24 who face really very significant challenges often in finding employment. According to the World Bank, 60% of young people worldwide are jobless. And even if they find work, they are disproportionately engaged in low productivity and low quality jobs with low remuneration and few opportunities. So in other words, the problem is not just unemployment, but also underemployment and the conditions under which work takes place. This lack of decent work, I think, reflects often and reinforces, of course, deep-seated and persistent inequalities, including those that are associated with migration and which are the focus of our discussion today. So when we start to narrow down on the situation of migration and decent work, what we see is that about 90% of international migration today is bound up with the world of work. An estimated 169 million of the 272 million people living outside of their countries of birth are moving because they're in some way economically active. And I think, and we'll hear a little bit more from our colleagues from ILO about this, this is probably a quite significant underestimate, of course, because we often don't have data to really capture the movement of people and their engagement in the labour market at all. So increased labour market is really a kind of phenomenon of our time. It's a feature of contemporary globalization processes. It includes the sort of universalization, if you like, of the capitalist mode of production and accumulation, but not necessarily control or responsibility for its costs and consequences. As a consequence, a growing proportion of migrants, particularly those who are in manual or semi-skilled sectors of the labour market, often face significant difficulties in accessing decent work in their host countries. And this, of course, includes those migrating between the countries of the Global South, some of which have very weak or developing economies and problems with job creation. And that forces many people, not just migrants, but often the wider population, to engage in precarious work and put themselves at risk of labour exploitation. So really in this session, we want to do two things. Firstly, we want to kind of get a better sense of what the evidence base is in relation to the relationships between decent work and migration. And we particularly want to hear, and I really hope the technology supports us in this, from the voices of migrants themselves who are often absent in some of these conversations. We'll be drawing on evidence from a recently published Dejusticia book entitled Migration and Decent Work, Challenges for the Global South, and you should have the link in the correspondence you've been sent. And that book, I think, is very important in really setting out very clearly the migrant experiences of the labour market, including low wages, poor working conditions, a virtual absence in many contexts of social protection, denial of freedom of association and workers' rights, as we'll hear later, as well as discrimination, xenophobia, and social exclusion. So we'll hear about those experiences, but just as importantly, how it undermines the possibility of migration contributing to delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals, and it impedes migrants' integration into their host societies. We know, and it's well documented, that those experiences can result in very significant human rights violations and indeed even death for migrants involved in those conditions. So we want to really set out the issues as we see them, but we also want our discussions to be very much solutions focused. So we'll hear about what UN agencies, trade unions and civil society are doing to address the challenges of ensuring that migrants in the Global South have the right to work on the one hand, and that those conditions of work are indeed decent. And I've encouraged our speakers today not just to tell us about the challenges associated with decent work in the Global South, but also the potential solutions. For example, ensuring that migrants, including refugees, have access to the labour market, reducing poor working conditions, insecurity and discrimination, and identifying remedies for exploitation, forced labour and wage theft. And I know we've got a number of member states also in the room represented. So it'd be great to also hear from you at some point in the conversation about what you think can be done to address these issues. We are going to produce a policy brief coming out of the event, so we'd like to capture some of the ideas, and you'll see possibly at the beginning of the event is being recorded also for that reason. So just a little bit briefly about the format of the event. As I say, it's been organised in partnership with Dejusticia. We'll be hearing from them shortly online. Dejusticia is a non-profit legal organisation established in 2005 that promotes human rights and the social rule of law in Colombia, Latin America and other regions in the Global South. We're also working today with the MIDEC Hub, which is probably one of the world's largest migration research projects, focusing on the relationships between migration, development and equality in 12 countries of the Global South. So we'll start with a presentation in a moment from Lucia Ramirez Bolivar from Dejusticia, and Lucia is co-author of the book that I referred to earlier. We're then going to have a video message from Felipe Gonzalez Morales, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Human Rights of Migrants, who unfortunately can't be with us today because he's currently on mission in Bangladesh, but wanted to share some brief remarks with us. And then we'll introduce each of us, our panelists in turn, and I'll introduce them as we go. You're very welcome to put your comments or any questions in the Q&A box if you're joining us online. In the room, you can just wave your hand or shake a piece of paper or whatever it takes to get my attention. And we'll come back to the speakers at the end just for some sort of, again, some final reflections and potentially one or two concrete suggestions as to how we might move forward on this topic. So without further ado, I would really like to introduce our first speaker, who, as I said, is Lucia Ramirez Bolivar, who joins us today from Colombia. Good morning, Lucia. It's very good to have you with us. Lucia is a lawyer specialized in constitutional law from the National University of Colombia and master in social work with emphasis on international social work and poverty and inequality from the University of Chicago. And she's worked in research, in litigation, in teaching and advocacy for human rights, especially in the context of forced migration and women's rights. And as I mentioned earlier, she's co-author of the book that has recently published on migration and decent work challenges for the Global South. Lucia, I know you have a presentation and we also have the videos. So perhaps when we come to screen the videos, you could just give us a heads up so that we can make sure that we sort out the tech at this end. You've got 20 minutes and we're very much looking forward to your contribution. Thank you, Lucia.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this space. Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much to the University of the United Nations for the invitation to share the book, Migration and Decent Work, and a special thanks to Professor Heben Crowley and Rafael for your interest and support. Do you see my presentation? Thank you. So as Heben was saying, during the next 20 minutes, I will present an overview of the book, share some testimonies of two migrants, one in Peru and one in South Africa, who work with some of the authors of the book. And finally, I will share some common trends about the different experiences that are documented in the video and in the book. Migration and Decent Work seeks to contribute to the debate of the guarantee of the fundamental right to work of migrants and refugees in the Global South from a human rights perspective as one of the main strategies to promote socioeconomic integration. Labor inclusion is one of the most effective forms of integration because it's allowed migrants and refugees to live in a more dignified conditions, contributes to social development, and strengthens relationships with the local population. It also has positive impacts on education, family reunification, political participation, and access to regular migration status. However, it is a major challenge for recipient countries, especially developing countries, which are characterized by high labor informality, unemployment, and wage disparities. Paradoxically, the migration policies of the North or the Global North countries are focused on closing borders, which prevents an equitable sharing of the responsibilities for caring for migrant and refugees population. This position deepens the inequalities between countries of the global and north, the global south and north and global north, and aggravates the condition of vulnerability of many migrants and refugees. This book brings together 9 chapters. You can access the book online, as Heben was saying, is published in our webpage, and the link was shared with you in the invitation. That bring together 9 chapters written by 16 activists, academics, and members of civil society organizations who have worked on the issue of migration from different angles, and who approach the challenge of labor inclusion from an interdisciplinary and human rights perspective. The selection of the countries that are included in the book is based on countries that are the main recipient countries of migrants and refugees in the world, and are from the global south. So now we would like to share with you 2 videos. The first one is from trans women in South Africa, who is a refugee and face challenges to access to work. So if you can please share that video.
We're just gonna send the message to Laura. Yep.
I'll just send
Would
it.
you mind
Thank you
just
very much.
taking out of your share screen, please?
Yes.
Thank you so much. And would you like the, I'm going to put up both videos and you just let me know which one it is, okay?
Is the one that is recorded by a cell phone?
Perfect. That's the right one.
Yeah, that one, exactly.
All righty. Sounds good.
Hi everyone, my name is Flaviana, Nancy Flaviana, and I come from Burundi and born in Bujumbura. The reasons I come to South Africa is because for my gender, and I come in South Africa 2008 December. Be LGBT community trans in Burundi do not accept, and here a lot transphobia, homophobia, and they can just to come to South Africa because I was activist, and when I finished high school, I just think to come. I think to find the country I can have freedom. So I'm trying to, I'm trying to pushing government if I can have a status, because it's taken me forever. I feel like it's more mental, emotionally, physically, because I can't find a job. If when you're sick, it's difficult to go to hospital. If we have an issue about the cases, police station also is the issue. In community is the issue. Everywhere you're going to traveling is very issue. So it's like I'm stuck. For myself, what I do, I'm activist for the different organization, and I'm do lobbying. And as a model, I do photo shooting as a model. That's where I do the documentary about my story, where I come from, and as well I'm professional massage body. That's my job I do for my life. I hope if I could win to get status and for gender market improving who I am, it'd be good for me, more opportunity for me to working for my activism, and as well to go to study, to pay my course for university, so and I can be able to have education like others.
So that video, like she shares her story and the difficulties that she has facing, like trying to find work, even though she has a 1-year work permit. And this video was produced by the Legal Resource Center in South Africa, who wrote one of the chapters of this book, and I will talk about that later. The next video is the testimony of a Venezuelan refugee in Peru. This one is in Spanish, but we include subtitles in English to make sure everyone can understand. So if you can please project the second one.
Les habla Jonathan Noguera Silva, docente venezolano radicado en Perú desde el año 2018. Los primeros retos que tenemos que afrontar como migrantes y profesionales venezolanos, sin duda, es el tema de la documentación, que pudiera ser considerado como tedioso, largo, costoso para muchos, y eso, por supuesto, impide que podamos desarrollarnos plenamente desde el mismo momento que llegamos a este país. Muy bien. De hecho, tener tu proceso de regularización y ya tu título validado no significa tener acceso a un empleo de calidad. Y te lo puedo decir desde mi testimonio, ¿no? Una vez que tenía todos mis documentos en regla, fui a uno de estos consorcios educativos y lamentablemente podíamos ver cómo en la entrevista parecía estar aprobado, ¿no? Y sentías incluso en el personal directivo cierta cercanía y hasta entusiasmo cuando en tu hoja de vida decía, oye, pero tienes hasta posgrado, oye, tienes estas especializaciones, tienes estos cursos, oye, qué bien. Y de pronto la respuesta era totalmente contraria a lo que tú habías percibido. Sin duda que eso te genera un choque emocional tremendo, ¿no? Y sigues, persistes, comienzas a ir a otros espacios y sucede lo mismo. Una cosa es la entrevista y otra cosa es el resultado, ¿no? Y cuando consigues a veces empleo, las condiciones de los contratos son totalmente desfavorables, cuando son en lapsos de tiempo mucho más cortos, cuando tú observas que eso no te genera ningún tipo de estabilidad. Imagínate tú en un contrato de 3 meses que tienes que renovarlo cada cierto tiempo si lo aprueban. Entonces tú como profesional, como padre, como persona, estás en una constante tensión sin saber qué va a ser de mañana. No sabes si estás aprovechando el tiempo o más bien estás perdiendo otra oportunidad.
Thank you so much. I think also this video is very interesting because it shares some of the challenges that you face as a migrant or refugee, even though you already have a work permit. So it's not only the possibility to regularize your situation, but also all the challenges that come after that are sometimes of administrative character, but also there is the issue of xenophobia, competencies between different sectors. Especially we have seen this in the region. The Venezuelan migrants and refugees in general and our population that is well educated with higher degrees, and unfortunately they don't always have the opportunity to practice their profession once they are trying to be included in the labor market. So I think that testimony also speak about those challenges and how that affect the integration in the long term of this population. So those videos are just two brief examples of what we talk in the book. The authors provide an overview of the right to work of migrants and refugees in various countries of the global south, from Mexico to India and from Argentina to Turkey, based on an analysis of the context, public policy, and the realities faced by these workers on a daily basis. I will then give you a really brief example of the topics that they address in the different articles. For example, Mexico analyzes the experience of migrant women, sex workers, and members of the police force that are fighting human trafficking in that country, and in a context of criminalization of sex work, and how in sometimes these policies that are trying to protect these women can be also have undesirable effects in the possibility of their decision to practice sex work, and also the possibility to regularize their situation. Costa Rica, for example, addresses the growth of female labor from Nicaragua in Costa Rica, their insertion in the domestic work sector, and the challenges that these women face to guarantee their rights. In Colombia, we assess the Colombian government response to guarantee of the right to work of migrants from Venezuela in the light of the national and international human rights legislation related to the right to work and the barriers that this population faces in accessing the labor market. The chapter from Peru provides a characterization of the Peruvian labor market, the impacts it has suffered due to the pandemic, and the situation of the Venezuelan migrants population in this context. The testimony that we just watched was produced by the Centro Equilibrium, which is the author of the article from Peru. In Argentina, the authors provide an analysis of the conditions of the labor insertion of Senegalese migrants and the context of informality that they face, as well as the racist practices that operate against these populations based on the logic of hypervisibilization by the state control, and also how that impacts their possibility to access to the labor market. Moving to the African continent, we have two chapters, one from Kenya and one from South Africa. In Kenya, they analyze the journey towards socioeconomic integrations of refugees in Kenya through the experience in the urban context and refugee camps and the legal framework that exists to protect the rights of this population. In South Africa, the authors explored the legal framework of the right to work of migrants in South Africa and discussed the social impacts of this legislation, as well as the tension between the legislative branch and the judicial system that seeks, the legislative branch seeks to limit the right of this population, while the judicial branch through its rulings, highlights the needs for refugees to be able to work as an exercise of their constitutional rights. So also I think this is, the book provides sociopolitical analysis, legal frameworks that the different countries have established to guarantee or not guarantee the right to work for migrants and refugees, and how the human rights framework
I think it's Lucia's end, isn't it? Yeah. She'll come back. Sorry, a few technical issues all around for the moment, but hopefully Lucia will come back in a second. Give Lucia one moment to hopefully come back to us. Okay, let's give her a moment to rejoin. I would say we would play Felipe Morales-Gonzalez note, but we're actually just trying to find that as well. So the tech is going well today. But here she is again. Hi, Lucia.
Sorry, I apologize. It closed suddenly.
Please continue.
Yeah, so I was talking about Turkey. So I was saying that the author argues that there is an inadequate interpretation of the international human rights legislation and the Turkish law regarding the right to work of this population. And finally, the chapter from India presents the risks of not having a comprehensive legal framework that guarantees the rights of refugees and pushes them into the informal labor market and puts them at risk of working in context of labor exploitation and violation of their a violation of their other rights. I think I have 2 more minutes. So is that correct, Hebe?
It's absolutely fine. In fact, you can take a few more if you like. I'm just sorting out some technology. So please carry on.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to share like the common trends and the main findings that you can also identify across the 9 chapters. So first one, these articles document and make visible situation of labor exploitation and policies and mechanisms that Global South countries have implemented to address migrations and refugees' need for employment. Even though we all know that there are situations of labor exploitation of migrants and refugees, it's difficult to document those cases, to pursue legal defense in these cases. So I think some articles provide explanation of why this happened, the difficulties. For example, in the chapter of Colombia, we identified that migrants and refugees are very scared of make complaints about situations of labor exploitations before the institutions because they have been threatened by employers. We identified a case, for example, in Cali, in Colombia, where one migrant worker complained before the authorities about a situation of labor exploitation, and then threatened him with fire all the Venezuelan migrant workers that were working for his company that have different branches in the city. So there are other factors that also limited the possibility of workers to complain before authorities and seek the protection of their rights. And also there is the lack of knowledge of how this process go, what authorities they should look for protection. Second, the book makes a call for an equitable distribution of the response to migration by the states of the global north and the global south, because we have seen that the main or the principal recipient countries for migrants and refugees are located in the global south. Third, several studies show that labor inclusion has positive impacts on other indicators of integration, as I said at the beginning. For example, educational attainment, family reunification, political participation, and access to regular migration status. The book also makes a call to take measures to guarantee decent work, not only for migrants, but for all workers, because that also creates a situation of competition in global south countries. For example, there is this myth about that migrant workers are coming to take the jobs of in the recipient communities, but research have found that that's not always the case. So the book makes a call to really guarantee better conditions for all the workers, both migrant workers and workers in the recipient communities, and also provides a close look to certain jobs, such as domestic work and sex work, in order to ensure that these situations that situations that make migrants workers more vulnerable have a close look by the authorities. Finally, the book makes, and some of the articles argue that it's important to broaden the scope of social policy programs to include migrants, so they can face situations of socioeconomic marginalization and have easier access to labor inclusion programs. For example, we found that in the region, in Latin America, there were some social programs social policy programs implemented during the pandemic to help families to face the consequences of the pandemic, the economic consequences of the pandemic, but unfortunately, in not all the cases, they include migrants and refugees. In some countries, they include
having a tech joy day today, aren't we, really? Hey. See if Lucia just comes back. If not, we might skip an item and move back to Felipe Gonzalo-Barros. Skip. Okay. Okay. If Lucia comes back, we'll ask her just to conclude. But in any case, I think she was coming towards the end of her presentation, and I mean, I think the book is absolutely worth a read, not least because, as she sets out in her presentation, it covers a lot of different types of work with people in different contexts geographically, and very much engages with the consequences also of the COVID pandemic. Lucia, you're back. Do you just want to wrap up for us?
Yes, sorry again for the issue with the internet is not working properly. So I was saying that it's important to include migrants and refugees in social policy programs, and finally design local plans to work with recipient communities, focus on promoting integration, solidarity, mutual respect, and peaceful conflict management. Thank you so much for your time, your attention. We hope that you can take a look at the book, and thank you again, Heaven, for this opportunity to share this book.
Thank you very much, Lucia, and especially with the internet issues. But I would also like to thank you very much as well for bringing the perspectives of two migrants into the room, because as I said in the introduction, so often we have these conversations without the presence of migrants for lots of different reasons, and it is important to hear those voices, even if only on video. So we're very grateful for that. I'm just wondering, Jack, should we skip on or should we?
Let's skip. We have the video.
We have the video. Great. Okay, so we'll move on past the message from Felipe Gonzalez Morales and come back to that shortly. But I wonder now if I could turn actually to our panelists. We have, as I said, 3 panelists who are with us today, and I'm going to introduce each of them before they speak. Michelle Layton is with us, joining us from the ILO. I hope we can see Michelle. Hi, Michelle. So relieved to see you after our technological issues this morning. So great to have you with us. I'd just like to warmly welcome you, Michelle, for joining us. Michelle is, as many of you will know, Chief of the Office of the Labour Migration Branch of the International Labour Organization, the ILO, for whom access to decent work is, of course, I would say, one of the core mandate issues of the organization. Michelle directs the office's work on labour migration and mobility, and she supports policies and programs related to migrants and refugees, whose experiences we've been hearing about this morning. She has expertise in the fields of international law, labour migration, human rights, and economic development. I wonder, Michelle, if I could take the liberty of asking you 2 questions, if you don't mind. Firstly, I guess, what is being done, and indeed what could or should be done to address some of the issues that we've been hearing about in terms of what migrant workers are facing in terms of access to decent work? And secondly, from the perspective of the ILO, what are the top 3 priorities in terms of taking action to ensure that the benefits associated with migration of the Global South don't come at the costs of migrants themselves and their families? You have 10 minutes, and we're really looking forward to your contribution. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, Heaven, and hope you can hear me.
We can.
Okay, good. Well, good morning, everyone, and really want to thank you for inviting me and the ILO on the panel today. It's a really important topic, and certainly migrant workers in the Global South are often workers in some of the most vulnerable and marginalized situations in society. They leave their homes, their families behind in search of decent opportunities, but they come to face quite a lot of discrimination. They face exploitation. Many suffer poor wages and working conditions, and they lack legal protections. We're very concerned that migrant workers can be forced to pay recruitment fees and costs to labor brokers, and this puts them at risk of forced labor, trafficking, debt bondage, and fee charging, of course, violates international labor standards. Our data are showing that these charges to migrants can be as high as 19 months equivalent in salary for a job. That's almost 2 years before they even can take any money home. And it's become a multi-billion-dollar business. Workers are often forced to sell family assets. They may have to borrow money at high interest rates, and to pay the fees, they may have to work extreme hours or take many jobs. And those who overstay their visas, of course, can become in irregular status and then vulnerable to further exploitation. And this is why the ILO adopted its Global Fair Recruitment Initiative and specific tools and guidance to help fight these abuses. We're working now in more than 30 countries on some aspect of fair recruitment. And what we're doing is trying to build the capacity of national institutions to regulate and oversee the recruitment process. And that means working with all kinds of stakeholders at the national level and with migrant workers, and certainly with industry and trade unions. We're concerned that many of the challenges faced by migrant workers are the result actually of fairly extensive poor governance mechanisms and the lack of cooperation between countries, including along migration corridors. And how these countries govern migration is really critical to ensuring that rights are protected and that migrants are treated fairly and equally in society and in the workplace. And there's too many countries which have weak protections or exclude migrants from labor protection entirely. Women migrant workers, for example, and those particularly in domestic work, suffer increased violence and harassment at work and are often, their jobs are excluded from the labor law or labor protection. Some of this is due to the lack of policy coherence between migration policy on the one hand and employment policy and rights on the other. And we think, of course, that migrant workers should be able to enjoy safe and healthy working conditions. They're entitled to the same rights and protections as national workers, and policies and practices, including minimum wage laws, health and safety regulations, and social security benefits really need to be recognized for migrant workers. We also know that countries are facing challenges in integrating migrant workers, and we just heard from Dejusticia about some of those issues. Certainly, they face the social and employment discrimination, and the lack of integration in the global south can have negative impacts, not just for migrant workers and their families, but societies and the communities that host them. We are providing direct technical assistance to countries and work with stakeholders to create options for decent work that help national workers as well as refugees and migrants. So we're working on areas where we help them access education, skills training, healthcare, social services. We support migrant resource centers that deliver direct services. Often these are run by trade unions, in fact, who can help them with access to justice. And we're very happy to see that businesses are also engaging more in migration dialogue. Both employers and workers organizations, our constituents, want to see migration policies that protect rights, but also meet real labor market needs. So that really requires governments to engage the world of work actors, employers and workers organizations in social dialogue when they're developing migration policy. This, I think the engagement of different stakeholders has also led to a focus on helping migrant workers gain the proper skills and training before they migrate. And certainly, as we heard our Venezuelan colleague who was in the Dejusticia video say, the lack of skills recognition and prior learning really is a barrier to development and to upward mobility of migrants. There are simply a lack of skills recognition mechanisms in many of these countries, lack of mechanisms for degree recognition and qualification systems. So this means that migrants are forced into taking low-paying or sometimes hazardous jobs. So we're giving support in different parts of the world now to governments on ways to ensure regional qualification frameworks can be adopted or mutual skills recognition. Sometimes the use of skills passport, also to evaluate the skills mobility partnerships. And we would want to see that these work for business and migrant workers. A large part of our work is related to improving data collection and monitoring that informs policy. So in answer to your first question, let me just say that, there's a lot that is going on in terms of providing assistance, but we need to do more. And I want to particularly highlight that the UN agencies' collaboration in this field is really important, and I think growing in importance. We're developing tools to support bilateral dialogue so countries can talk to each other and create regular pathways. This is something that ILO co-leads. It's a process within the UN Network on Migration. And we've helped to create the first UN system-wide guidance on bilateral labor migration agreements. We hope this is a means to usher in a new era of rights-based agreements for pathways that can help migrant workers access decent work, and certainly more dialogue in the global South. Now, Evan, you asked me about the priorities for action, and I think I've sort of given you an overview of the kinds of work we do. But certainly it's important to note that the benefits associated with migration in the global South should not come at a cost for the well-being of migrants and their families. And for ILO, maybe I can just sum up some of the top priorities for action that we see for addressing issues that impact migrant workers and refugees, because both are often in the same situations, and to improve labor market functioning. And so if I had to sum up, I would say, first, the fair and equal treatment in society and in the workplace of migrants and refugees. And that means really providing access to decent work opportunities. The inclusion and integration of migrants and refugees in our society is critical, and these are very much linked. And then bilateral and multilateral cooperation. So a lot of change we think has to happen at the national level, and it can also happen and be spurred by bilateral and regional cooperation. But so much comes down to that national level action. We should not just continue business as usual. So we believe that there's a need to accelerate our actions now and advance fair migration governance and management. And as I indicated, this means taking concrete steps so that migrant workers are recognized in law and in practice to having the same rights and protections as national workers. Of course, in the areas I mentioned, occupational safety and health, wages, social protection, they should not be seen as those in the workplace who deserve less protection. And that certainly can lead to social dumping and undercut the labor market. They also need their fundamental rights protected. And in far too many countries, and I will include, there are many in the global South, they cannot access their rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining. And I hope our colleagues from ITUC who are going to be able to, Paula hopefully is on, are going to be able to talk to some of these fundamental rights issues. So part of this priority is to bring coherence between migration and employment policies that can help integrate migrants into the labor market and reduce discrimination. The conventions that ILO has, the tools and guidance, we are really encouraging governments to adopt these, to implement these, because they provide the kind of guidance needed for government policy to really improve their fairness and their protection of rights of migrant workers, as well as helping the business community in areas such as fair recruitment. Integrating migrant workers in labor markets can also help meet labor shortages. So that is very clear. And I mentioned the business community's key focus on skills matching, skills and jobs matching, and helping ensure that those skills are obtained by migrants and that they are able to access skills development and improve their ability for upward mobility in the labor market. And of course, social dialogue is one of the most important tools. And this really means governments have to create the space, a particularly formal social dialogue, to bring in the voice of business, the voice of trade unions when they're designing policies. And we found in the ILO that is really, I mean, of course, it's part of our DNA as ILO, a tripartite organization, but we've really found it to be one of the most successful strategies for governments in tackling these world of work issues, and particularly when it comes to migration governance. So let me conclude by saying that the challenges faced by migrant workers are significant. They are going to require a comprehensive response. And for the benefits to really be shared fairly, the rights and well-being of migrant workers has to be put center of how we develop our policies and governance mechanisms. And I hope that we can all work with a real sense of purpose toward these issues. I just want to recall what Malala Yousafzai has said, earlier about we cannot succeed. We cannot all succeed when half of us are held back. And that certainly is something to consider when we're talking about what migrant workers face in accessing decent work. So I do believe they deserve our attention. I'm really delighted that you're having this dialogue today. So thank you very much. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Michelle. Many interesting and important comments and points. I think we'll potentially come back to those in the discussion. And just a reminder for those of you online, if you want to make any comments or questions for our panelists, then please do put your points in the Q&A box. So thank you, Michelle, indeed. I mean, my ears always prick up when I hear people talking about corridors, because of course MIDEC also works in corridors. This idea of, and you said it in terms of bilateral labor agreements, but just more generally, really understanding the dynamics of movement between countries and regions, I think is really critical. The idea of policy coherence, we're hearing a lot more about it, but the idea that migration can be separated off from the rest of what goes in society is clearly not sustainable. And you talked about social dialogue. I wondered whether you were also hinting at one point towards the politics of all of this as well, of course. So we might come on to the politics, it's slightly more controversial, but I think in many national contexts, this idea that migrant workers are undermining, taking jobs from the domestic labour market is, in terms of the political narrative, quite problematic in terms of then mobilising around migrant rights and justice. So we'll maybe come on to this, and I'm sure that when Paola speaks, she'll have something to say on that, certainly in terms of collective bargaining and mobilisation. So thank you, Michelle. We'll certainly return to you in the Q&A and at the end for some final remarks. But I want to turn now to our next speaker, who thankfully, given the tech, is in the room. So Sarah Mehta, it's very good to have you with us. Sarah is currently head of international projects at the Migrant Justice Institute. Sarah is a international human rights lawyer, who's worked on human rights in the US and access to justice more globally. And prior to joining MGI, she directed Columbia Law School's Trial Watch project in partnership with the Clooney Foundation for Justice, monitoring and evaluating criminal trials in Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East, and advocating for legal reform. The Migrant Justice Institute uses legal research, advocacy, and legal action to achieve fair treatment and justice for migrant workers globally, with a particular focus, I would say, certainly in terms of the relationship with MIDEC and our work with the issue of wage theft. So, Sarah, it's a pleasure to have you with us. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this idea of wage theft, its scale, and the kind of forms that it takes, and what do governments need to do to address this issue of wage theft, and who else apart from governments has got a kind of role to play in tackling some of this, or needs to be involved in some way. You've got 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Heben. And it's such a novel to be in person. I literally don't know where to look actually in the room, but I'll try and answer those questions with sort of an overview of wage theft globally and some of the recommendations that we have at Migrant Justice Institute to try and interrupt that cycle of exploitation. I want to also thank Dejusticia, whose work I've really long admired, for this really thoughtful book on the different barriers that migrants face in accessing the formal labor market, but also protecting their rights therein. So as many people have already discussed today, migrant workers are in a very unique, vulnerable situation, sometimes excluded by law from working in the formal labor market, and also from joining trade unions, often relegated to the lowest paid jobs with the least amount of regulatory oversight, legal protection, and visibility. We've just heard a couple of different references to the sort of long-standing misconception, often fueled by xenophobia, as well as economic insecurity, that migrants come to take away jobs and depress wages. But in reality, and regardless of whether a worker has left home as a refugee or with a work permit, migrant workers have always been certainly a critical and permanent part of the global labor force, whose labor and their earnings are essential not only for themselves and their families, but also to the communities that they enter and the communities they're supporting in their home countries. Laws and policies that have undercut migrants' rights in the workforce also dilute the rights and voice of all workers in that sector by contributing to a system of impunity for labor violations. Now, in response to one of your questions, Heben, about the scale, as you also referenced earlier, there's sort of a dearth of good global data on any of these things. But despite that lack of global data, even at the national level, we know that wage theft is responsible for the loss of billions of earnings for workers every year. And migrant workers are probably the most exploited and the least likely to recover wages when employers fail to pay them. There are approximately 169 million migrant workers in the world, providing essential services from healthcare to construction to agriculture. And they often work in the industries that are likely the most likely to have serious health, safety, and pay violations and suffer from the least amount of legal oversight. According to our colleagues at the ILO, migrant workers comprise 5% of the global workforce and yet also account for 15% of cases of forced labor. One of the 5 main indicators of forced labor, and again, the most common and endemic factor, according to ILO statistics, is the non-payment of wages. The UN Global Compact has recognized that respect for workers' rights and compliance with labor standards are the foundation of decent work. And similarly, under the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there's a recognition of decent work as a human right, and that means that states have to protect the labor rights of all workers, including migrants. And yet, for all that, systemic wage theft has long been an endemic and pervasive fact in the global workforce, and intractable, not because it's actually impossible to resolve, but often because the burden of addressing it has been left almost exclusively with migrant workers themselves, who lack the political power and voice in the countries that they're working in to affect that type of policy change. Now, certainly, and I think the Dejusticia book really pulls this out as well, in the global south, many workers, regardless of their migration status, are trapped in an exploitative labor market with very limited enforcement of their labor rights. But for migrant workers, there's a unique situation because for many of them, their very right to be in the country is dependent upon an employer. And reporting wage theft to state authorities comes with very real risks in terms of their employment and actually their legal status as well. So on the one hand, migrant workers who arrive with work authorization know that making a claim means risking retaliation, specifically the loss of their job and possibly then their legal status and any future employment. For migrants who do not work with authorization, a complaint about wage theft can result in their arrest, detention, and deportation by immigration authorities. And for both situations, there's no guarantee that a worker who comes forward will actually be able to recover wages that they're owed. In most countries, there is some system by which all workers, regardless of their migration status, can technically claim unpaid wages, but in reality, these processes are inaccessible to the overwhelming majority of migrant workers. Because of the risks that I've just flagged, most workers are not going to feel comfortable coming forward at all until potentially the end of their contract, if they're on a work contract and about to leave the country, or if they're given some meaningful assurance that coming forward will give them some protection from deportation and will not subject them to other types of criminal sanctions. But in most countries, and really this is true in the global north just as much as in the global south, labor regulatory bodies are very poorly resourced. They don't have the staff and the time to investigate claims. So they are relying on the migrant workers themselves to bring labor exploitation to the fore. But again, this is a very significant burden on vulnerable workers who might be in the country only temporarily and might just be thinking about their immediate survival. The legal processes that do exist are overwhelmingly very long and often very complicated. Even a very simple claim about wage theft, where you might not think there are that many facts in dispute, can take months or years to resolve. And during that time, a worker who's there with authorization may have had to leave the country. Right now, there are very few jurisdictions that have a system in place by which migrant workers can pursue a claim after their departure. And for the people who remain in the country, unless they have the right to work and support themselves while waiting for the case to move forward, many are simply going to abandon their claims rather than go on with a course that involves significant costs for them. Most wage claims might be pursued initially through mediation. Once you get to the court level, similarly with mediation, actually, migrants have very limited prospects for justice, and often because they're not represented by any legal counsel. Hearings usually require evidence that the worker themselves is unlikely to have. They take place in urban centers, which might be very far from where the worker lives and works, and they require the worker to, at their own cost, travel and take off significant amount of time to travel back and forth to go to court hearings. The migrant workers, as I said, often have no legal or other types of assistance in those hearings, regardless of where they are, even when they're facing off against a corporation who might be quite well resourced. If at the end of the process, a worker actually does get a successful judgment against the employer, one thing that we found from our partners all over the world is that courts are actually rarely able to enforce those judgments. Sometimes the business will declare bankruptcy, it might disappear overnight, often it will just refuse to pay. And again, because of these significant risks and costs that the workers themselves face in coming forward, combined now with this low likelihood of success, that they will actually win and receive the benefits of a judgment, most workers make a very strategic decision not to come forward at all. We conducted a report in 2018 in Australia with a survey of over 4,000 migrant workers. And we found that 91% of those workers who were underpaid didn't tell anyone, didn't take any further action with that information. Of the 194 individuals who actually did try to pursue a claim, 67% recovered absolutely nothing by going forward. And that again is in a country that's fairly well resourced, right? So in our work at Migrant Justice Institute, we are looking at what processes and policies do exist in different countries that allow for a migrant worker to come forward and what governments can do to improve some of those processes and interrupt the cycle of exploitation. I'll just highlight 4 very quickly given the time. But the first is to think about delinking a work permit from a specific employer so that a migrant worker who doesn't have to stay in an exploitative job just to remain lawfully in the country. Second is providing protection from deportation and some short-term permissions to stay in the country with work rights so that a migrant worker is actually able to go through the process and pursue a claim to recover their wages. Third is to improve the labor court system itself and create processes that are more simplified to expedite and streamline claims by migrant workers. This can include, for example, shifting the burden of proof off the worker and more onto the employer in some of these cases. It can mean providing opportunities for advanced testimony and evidence collection before workers left the country, and exploring the use of technology to allow workers to pursue their claims even after they've left the country. Fourth, and finally for now at least, our other thought is about expanding liability up the supply chain so that the businesses then the best position to pay for the labor that they have benefited from will actually do so rather than leaving that burden of unpaid wages on the migrants themselves. We've seen that businesses are starting to understand more about their responsibility to take on some of the costs that migrant workers are having to bear by themselves. We heard Ms. Late speak about recruitment fees in particular. But in general, if you want to have a supply chain that is free of forced labor and modern slavery, that means that businesses themselves will have to absorb some of the cost of unpaid wages. Now, some of these reforms require some transnational collaboration, but many of them are reforms to national migration and national labor systems that really do need meaningful political support and investment in the rights of non-citizen workers. And these reforms in turn bolster the rights of all workers in that community by raising the floor. Ultimately, the failure to ensure that migrant workers are paid and have access to justice when they're not is really a core rule of law issue, because depriving citizens of decent work and non-citizens creates a permanent situation of vulnerability and discrimination against migrants and allows for this culture of impunity. To date, states have put a lot of resources, frankly, more into criminalizing some forms of trafficking and irregular migration, but there's been less commitment to ensuring affirmative protection for migrants' rights and holding businesses accountable for forced labor. That dynamic and prioritization is going to have to shift in order to ensure that migrant workers are respected as rights holders and not just relied upon as available labor. I'll stop there, and I'm excited to learn more from our colleagues in the conversation to follow. Thanks, Evan.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, that's a very comprehensive overview of some of the issues, but also, I mean, I think this point about holding business to account ultimately. The beneficiaries of wage theft are the businesses that are involved in those processes. So we want to engage businesses as partners. The private sector engagement is obviously a very strong agenda within the current migration governance strategies, but also holding them to account for those violations of the rights of migrant workers. So thank you very much for that very concrete, practical set of suggestions that we can take forward in the conversation. Thank you. I'm going to move over now to our final speaker, Paola Simonetti. Welcome, Paola. It's really very nice to have you here with us today. Paola is Director of the Equality Department of the International Trade Union Confederation, the ITUC, that we heard about earlier a little bit. Her work is aimed at ensuring that people can work and live in conditions characterized by dignity, by equality, and by justice. And in this position, she leads trade unions' actions in key areas such as global migration governance, economic integration of women, fighting gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work, and organizing against discrimination and exclusion of marginalized workers. Paola, we know, and we've heard already in brief, that organizing and collective bargaining has always been central, not just to the struggle of migrant workers, but to the struggle of all workers in the labor market. So I'm wondering, in that context, what role can and do the trade unions play in securing access to decent work and in reducing poor working conditions, and specifically perhaps in relation to migrant workers in the global south, for whom the trade union movement may in some context not be as accessible or strong? Thank you. You've got 10 minutes and we look forward to your contribution.
Thank you very much, Heaven, and thank you very much to all the distinguished people in the room and the audience, and of course to the previous speakers. So the International Trade Union Confederation, for those who are not really familiar, represents 200 million workers in 163 countries. And we presently have 332 national affiliates around the world. So this is a very important conversation because, of course, worker rights and migrant worker rights are really at the forefront of the ITUC and the trade union global movement in terms of priorities for engagement and really for action. So I will try, as I was asked, to provide a few examples on how trade unions could be really instrumental in protecting and implementing the rights of migrant workers around the world. But before that, I really would like to say what is our vision regarding the global migration governance. And therefore, we have, first of all, our vision is that for trade unions, a worker is a worker regardless of their migration status. And seems obvious, but it's not. And as such, we view the rights-based migration governance as an essential part of the larger structural change that we need in order to create an economy that respects and protects all the workers. And then trade unions globally welcome migrants. We want to reiterate that. We welcome migrants, we welcome refugees and asylum seekers, and we demand for them the right to work in dignity and equal treatment for everyone. And therefore, again, we demand a rights-based governance of migration that, as Michelle recalled, is designed and implemented through social dialogue, so through the dialogue among governments, employers, and worker representatives, with labor standards, international labor standards at the forefront. At the same time, it's also necessary to ensure that migration is the result of a choice and is not enforced, and therefore including measures to stop conflicts around the world. Unfortunately, we are in the middle of it, tackle climate change equally, and of course, inequality. So specifically, what we are calling the governments of the world on is to go for and implement what we call a new social contract. A new social contract that is based on 6 main pillars. First of all, the creation of jobs. But these jobs have got to be climate-friendly jobs with just transition. And therefore, the ITUC is calling for 575 million new jobs by 2030, including the formalization of at least 1 billion formal jobs. This is crucial for migrant workers. Investment in the care economy, it's a main economic sector where we want these jobs to be created. And this is the economic sector where migrant workers are overrepresented. And also aligns with our call for governments to prioritize regularization schemes for migrants in an irregular situation, and therefore increase the rights-based regular migration pathways for migrants and refugees. This, of course, has to go hand in hand with the rights dimension, with the right pillar for all workers, regardless of their employment or immigration status, and therefore including maximum working hours and health and safety at work. So access to rights requires complete status protection for migrant workers where they exercise their rights and take action to enforce labor and employment laws. Trade unions demand, therefore, this implementation, the respect and the implementation of the rights to freedom of association, the right to organize, the right to collective bargaining, because these are indispensable pillars to ensure decent work for all, obviously including migrant workers. And mind you, according to our data, to our labor rights index, unfortunately, legislation in over 20% of countries exclude migrant workers from the right to organize. Sarah mentioned before very, very eloquently the issue of wage theft. And of course, wage justice is one of the pillars within our call of the new social contract. So including minimum living wages for all workers. And we have heard how systemic violation of migrant worker rights include rampant wage theft. And therefore, again, our call for minimum living wages stems promptly and primarily in our call from the trade union, global trade union movement. Again, of course, we don't forget about social protection. Michelle mentioned it before. This is one of the main themes within what she mentioned when she talked about the bilateral labor migration agreement. So we are calling for universal social protection because, of course, this is especially in the case for the migrant women workers who are overrepresented in the informal economy. They need to be, of course, protected, and not just in the country of origins, but also in the country of destination, where actually they do they work and they have their jobs. Within that, of course, we want also the establishment of a social protection fund for the countries that are most in need and need more resources in order to provide this universal social protection. And then last but not least, equality and inclusion. These are the two, of course, other important pillars of the new social contract, ending all forms of discrimination and exclusions, and of course, a rights-based development model, which is premised on the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, it was mentioned before how Goal 8 on inclusive growth, full employment, and decent work is central to the protection of migrant workers. But we say from the trade union movement that SDG 8 is really an enabler, it's an enabling goal for the realization of all the goals within the Agenda 2030. So unfortunately, if we are not serious about achieving Goal 8, it will be impossible or very difficult to achieve the other goals within the Agenda 2030. So what do we do concretely around those issues? Of course, as you know, we are a global organization, and we work at the global level, representing the voice of trade unions globally. And for example, trade unions we have been advocating under the Global Compact on Migration, a specific commitment to fair recruitment and decent work for migrants. And this, of course, this is an important keeps staying an important reference and point for engagement for international trade union movement. We have been participating in 2022 to the first international migration review of the Global Compact on Migration, really advocating the international labor standards, the International Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Now, and I would like also to share with you that regrettably, the final declaration is still missing and missed a direct commitment on adherence to ILO labor standards for all workers. And this is still astonishing in our view, since globally, out of 281 million migrants, 169 million are migrant workers. So missing a commitment on international labor standards in there, in our view, it's really a weakness that, of course, needs to be addressed in the years to come. But also, I would like also to recall that as ITUC, we are also very much engaged on the fair recruitment front. It was already described, so I don't take time to describe, the raising recruitment costs, debt bondage, and all their consequence that unfortunately entails for migrant workers. But also the ITUC in 2018 developed a recruitment monitoring tool called a recruitment advisor website. And this is, of course, we work really hand in hand with the ILO. Michelle mentioned, of course, their policy tool and orientation tool as well. Where migrant workers can also share their recruitment experience through this platform. It's an online platform, which allows for evidence-based policy reform. And then currently the website is actively used by trade unions in Bangladesh, in the Philippines, in Nepal, in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and other countries. And we really plan to expand the coverage, the geographical coverage of this tool. And then on organizing a collective bargaining, Heaven, really coming to your question. Trade unions involvement, of course, at national level can vary on many levels. Of course, trade union campaign for the ratification and implementation of the ILO Convention, Convention 97, Convention 143, that are, the main convention regarding migrants, the International Labour Organization Convention. But they also, of course, organize information campaigns on rights. They also provide direct assistance in the form of legal aid to workers, skills training, support to skills recognition, and many other support. I would like to mention a couple of cases and then I will wrap up. So for example, in Bahrain, where around 70% of workers are migrants, trade unions were able to negotiate a pay rise for street sweepers and drivers of garbage trucks working at the Gulf Cleaning Company, thanks to unionizing migrant workers in this company. And this is a significant result because many migrant workers were afraid at the beginning of joining unions, fearing dismissals and deportation. So the unions were actually able to overcome this challenging with organizing campaign, and there actually were able to unionize 800 workers for a total of 1,000 migrant workers. And this is this is just an example on how the organizing can actually be, an instrumental and fundamental tool to protect migrant workers. Another example in Peru, for example, our affiliate, the trade unions, have been running information campaigns for workers from Venezuela to regularize their status. And this really is recalling the example that was presented at the beginning, contained also in the book. And also they are pushing for a change in the national legislation. So you see, also the role of trade union can be also really in pushing a renewed legislation that now limits the percentage of foreigners which can be employed by an employer. And then you can imagine how this can be penalizing, of course, the status and the rights of migrant workers, preventing their access to social protection, and rendering them vulnerable, of course, to exploitation and abuse. In Brazil, for example, another affiliate. Yes.
Sorry, just in the interest of time, and we want to have time
Yes.
for questions. So if you just give one more example and then wrap.
I will wrap it up right now. So on recognition of professional qualification, this is an example of our affiliate in Brazil is actually engaging. And then I would like to conclude to say that the integration of migrant workers also in the countries of in the country of destination in the global north, although we are talking very much about the south, is also very much important. And therefore there are examples that I can share with you in France, but also in Italy, where the trade unions are really forging agreements with employers, but also with local institutions in order to train migrant workers and to support the integration in a pathways of work and employment, and therefore to support the integration and the participation in the wider society of migrant workers. So I would like to conclude to say that organizing, freedom of association, collective bargaining, and social dialogue are really concrete instruments for the protection of rights and the integration at the workplace, in unemployment, and in the wider society of migrant workers. Thank you very much for the attention, and sorry for being a little bit longer than.
Thank you. Thank you, many interesting points there, and the sort of facts like 20% of countries unable to allow organization of migrant and foreign workers, for example. I think these are very useful contextual figures that give us a sense again of the scale of the problem. There are some questions coming in already, including in relation to the trade unions. And I know there's some in the room. I do want to just very quickly, if we can, show the video that Felipe González Morales sent to us. It's only a couple of minutes, so we'll still have time. As you may know, Felipe González Morales has been the special rapporteur on the human rights of migrants since 2017. He's previously been the commissioner and rapporteur on migrants in the Inter-American Committee on Human Rights, and he just wanted to send a few words in support of this particular event. Thank you.
Morning to everybody. I congratulate the organizers of this event and the editors and authors of the book entitled Migrations and Decent Work, Challenges for the Global South. As the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on the Human Rights of Migrants, I really appreciate this book, which provides a whole picture about the situation in the Global South in this regard. Unfortunately, I'm not able to participate either in person or online, because at the time of the seminar, I'm going to be on an official visit in Bangladesh. The issue addressed in the book is of key importance for the protection of the human rights of migrants. I myself had the opportunity to work on this specific issue, among others, during the preparation of the Global Compact for Migration. And throughout my mandate as a special rapporteur, I have addressed this issue on numerous occasions and regarding many countries. In particular, I would like to stress its importance regarding the integration of migrants into the destination societies. As they have decent jobs, that means that they will be able to advance in the integration of the society. This, of course, has a major impact on the enjoyment of economic and social rights, and it's also connected with the migratory status. In fact, for the next Human Rights Council of the United Nations, I am working in the preparation of a report about regularization of migrants. And to be sure, the possibility that migrants can have a decent work depends on very much on their migratory status, and especially the fact that they are regularized. I would also like to stress the importance of establishing firewalls, that is a division between all the governmental agencies and the migratory agencies. So persons, even those in an irregular situation, are not afraid to apply for jobs or to work because of fear of being detained and expelled. And finally, I would like to stress, as several of the chapters of the book do, the situation of women migrants, who many times are in a especially vulnerable position in this regard. And of course, they need a much careful attention on the part of the authorities to ensure that they have a decent work. So I congratulate you again and hope you have a very good conference. Bye.
Thank you very much, Lauren. So we've got half an hour or so for any comments, any questions, any points that you in the room would like to make. And I know there are many people who have different interfaces with this particular topic, including from some member states. Let's take a few questions in a round and then hand over back to our panelists. But Daniel, you're first. Would you like to also introduce yourself just very briefly so that people know who you are?
Thank you. Good morning or good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Naujoks, and I research and teach migration and refugee studies at Columbia University, where I also direct the UN Studies program at the School of International Public Affairs. Actually, this year, 20 years ago, I started my migration career at the ILO. So decent work in migration is very, very dear to my heart. From what I hear and from the many projects I've led and research I've done on this issue, I always find that there's sometimes these technocratic shortcomings, right? Where like, okay, there's a policy, but it doesn't really work. But often there is something you could call strategic separation, where it's not by chance. And most people in the room here, we are in the migration community, we all believe in that migrants should have access to real decent jobs, right? And decent work opportunities. But again, this shared conviction is not there. So Heaven mentioned at some point the politics, and as many of you know, like Martin Roos and Philip Martin had this idea a couple of years ago, rights versus numbers, which led to a book by Martin Roos called The Price of Rights. But the idea is, well, you can have fewer migrants, give them all great rights, or you have a lot of migrants, and then that means you are not willing to give them rights, including labor rights. And I'm not entirely sure this is completely true, but of course, the question is, to what extent, what can we do to overcome the idea of a dual labor market, right? The idea that, oh, if I have people who don't get full wages and we can exploit them more, this is actually better for the labor market. They're not surrogates, they're not competitors with natives or whoever we want to protect. So this is, I think, the core of this. And sometimes, of course, there's a fig leaf like Turkey, who adopted a migration law for the Syrian refugees and said, oh, you can't get labor work permits, and then I think 0.4% of the actually, because of how it was the process of getting one were excluded, right? And theoretically have one, it was not meant for all those 3.8 million Syrians to get a work permit, right? But how can we overcome those political hurdles? I think is much more critical than small technocratic tweaks, even though the latter are definitely also important. Thank you.
Thank you. Both a comment and a question, and I think we'll
but I guess how do we do that, and how do we address the political dimension? That's my question to all the esteemed colleagues in the room.
And I guess tied to that as well, what we might call a policy practice gap, right? We have a lot of legislation, a lot of policy. We have the Global Compact on Migration, which sets out very clearly some of the aspirations, but the translation of that into practice in these deeply politicized contexts and contexts of broader poverty is the issue. I'm going to gather up some questions and go back. So I'm going to go through a few online questions, and I'll come back to the people in the room. The first question: what kind of policies can island nations implement in order to accept migrants coming from South American countries such as Venezuela, especially if the island nation has not ratified the 1951 convention? The second question, I'm just literally going to read this out. You can decide as panelists which ones you would potentially like to take. Second question, clearly as other rights, the respect of labour rights is linked to migration status. We've heard quite a lot about the issue of regularisation. So what activities can unions develop for regularising undocumented migrants? What can be done in that respect? How can we concretely translate this aspiration into something in practice? And question three, and also a nice comment, thank you for the wonderful presentations. How would you think that all the intergovernmental processes taking place at the UN this year, I guess alluding to, again, the GCM, can address the challenges of decent work for migrants? I think there's some overlap between those questions. So why don't we invite in our panelists first to take whichever question they would like to respond to, and then we'll come back in the room and do another round. Is it possible, Jack, to see the panelists on the screen? Yes. Wonderful. Can we also have Michelle? I'm hoping Michelle is still there. Michelle is there, or we can't see Michelle for some reason. Here she comes. Wonderful. Wonderful. So here we have our panelists, and here we have our colleagues in the room. Michelle, can I ask you, I'm not sure which of those questions, I hope you heard them, you'd like to take, perhaps you could respond to one of those, and potentially around the kind of intergovernmental processes and how we bridge this gap in the context of the political opposition or mobilization against migrant labor in many contexts.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I mean, I found that this is really an interesting discussion, and of course, so are the questions. And I heard Felipe mentioned, you know, a lot about his new report coming out on irregular labor migration or irregular migration and what we can do. I think Paul has, on our team, has posted a report that we issued last year on irregular migration and responses to that countries can undertake to ensure that there are more regular pathways. And this, I think, goes to some of the questions I've heard about the Pacific and addressing irregular migration and so on. I mean, we know that when there are lots of barriers to allowing migrants to come in and take jobs, that there may still be demand for those jobs, and migrant workers or migrants will find ways to try and come in, or they're in the country and they may take a job, but then their status becomes irregular. And they don't have the right documentation, or the processes are so complex that they are not able to navigate the complexities, and so are out of regular status. And of course, this puts them in more precarious situations of abuse. But what countries, of course, can do is adopt regularization processes. And I think that is one of the recommendations that quite a number of experts and agencies are making to governments. If you have a significant number of irregular migrants, many of them may be in jobs, but regularizing them will prevent undercutting of the labor market. Because if they're already working in the labor market, and most of them would be, they're probably working under the table. They're probably in informal economy. They're not getting paid the wages they deserve. And that means that national workers who have similar jobs are the wage depression may affect them. So it doesn't make sense to not try to look at and consider regularizing these migrants as a way to adjust their status and make sure that they're not illegal in a sense, and then working underground and being exploited. And that would affect us all. The other is, of course, to take a look at the migration policies. I mean, I mentioned the issue of governance. It's so critical. There's a lack of coherence. If you look at labor demand and the kind of opportunities for migrant workers, and you really institute a process of social dialogue, you should be able to come to an agreement on migration policy that will work for everyone, or at least that will be amenable to receiving more support and help integrate migrants in the workplace. So the fact that countries in some cases are putting up more barriers is not necessarily, or hasn't shown in history, to be a recipe for actually preventing that kind of migrants from falling into irregular status. Of course, we would say at the ILO that creating decent work opportunities in countries of origin is paramount. I mean, making sure migration is voluntary and not a necessity has to be a real priority for, I think, all countries where they have large numbers of migrants who are forced to leave. And of course, ensuring that there's gender parity and that gender issues are taken care of. Many women are not allowed in certain occupations. That tracks not only in national countries of origin and destination, but also within the kinds of migration pathways that are available. So there certainly is a need to open up more regular pathways. The Pacific Islands can do that with or without their joining the 1951 convention. That should not be a barrier to those policies. And in fact, we have considerable work on climate change, which is impacting the Pacific Islands, where we're looking at labor migration opportunities, and there's a regional labor migration or migration agreement being discussed right now to maybe make more of those pathways regular. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. I mean, that point about the interconnection, the relationships between migrant workers and the broader workforce and what undermining the rights of migrant workers is doing to other workers in other sectors, I think that's a really critical one. Sarah, you made a quite similar point, I think, in your presentation. Did you want to take one of those questions or elaborate on Michelle's point?
I mean, happy to, although I also want to defer to the people online while they still have internet access. But I'll only just add that, yes, I mean, there are things in different states, and maybe to also point on to what Daniel was asking also, there are different states that do feel some incentives at this moment coming from different perspectives to put in some regularization policies or create some bridge visas and other ways to regularize status. And some of that has also helped, at least in the research that we're doing right now. We have 2 policy guides coming out about what states can do for migrants who are departing versus what states can do to help allow migrants stay in the country longer. And sometimes this is also about bilateral agreements between countries and what the country that is the country from which migrants are leaving can do on behalf of their migrants, which again is going to depend both on their political power and where their migrants are going to. There are some countries that receive a huge number of their remittances, right, and that's a huge part of their GDP from their migrant workers. So they may have different incentives to push where they can in certain countries to protect their workers' rights. But there's others where they don't necessarily have that political power dynamic, and they may not be quite as invested in doing that. That said, there are plenty of pragmatic things that states can do, and certainly our perspective is also that all states, certainly the host countries, also have an investment in the appropriate enforcement of their labor laws and making sure that labor violations come to light and are addressed, because it is a core rule of law issue. And in order to do that, you also have to look at migration policies that make it impossible for people to either regularize or work in a situation where their rights can be respected. So hopefully there are some incentives to do that, at least from states' own rule of law interests, and there are policies that can be adopted in place in terms of what pushes states to do that. I think the incentives are going to be very different depending on the market.
Just a sort of follow-up question. Are there any states that are regularizing? You mentioned, for example, bridge visas. The topic of regularization, again, is highly political in many contexts, but are you seeing any evidence of any countries at all that are prepared to do this, particularly those that have high remittance transfers?
I mean, I think what we're sort of looking at on the sort of short-term interportability model is that there are countries like Canada and New Zealand and Finland that have models for which people who come on a work visa can then leave that work visa and go to others. It's also in Taiwan and some other countries in East Asia. With policy brief coming out, so the research to be determined. But I think there is at least some pathways in countries that recognize that in order to protect the workers' rights in particular, you need to bridge this gap over the migration status to make sure that there is greater portability across visas.
Thank you. Lucia, I wonder if I might come back to you on this issue of politics. I mean, as the kind of organization you are, you're trying to mobilize people around some of these issues, and Daniel was pointing out, the difficulty of doing that. Is that a question you'd be happy to take for us?
Yes, actually, that was the one I was thinking that I could contribute. So I think regarding the work that we have been doing here in Colombia, and also the book, we have support our position in 4 main points. The first one is not only talk about the right to work, but also to talk about it in a context of integration and the benefits of migration, because from our point of view, and also civil society organization in the regions, is not only about guarantee employment, but also to guarantee decent work and in a context of integration. So socioeconomic development and access to employment is a part of integration. So that type of discourse has been accepted by political actors, and also showed the complexity and the importance to face this situation as a society. Not only is a responsibility only from the government, but also how the importance to include employers or community So that's one point. And the second is to insist in the perspective of human rights, because sometimes it's only some actors talk about the
Lucia. Okay, let's move to Paola and hopefully, Lucia, you're back. You're back. It was a brief interlude.
Oh yeah, it was weird because for me, I continue, sorry about that. So I was saying that the importance also to include the human rights perspective, because for some actors is an economic debate, but they don't take into account the human rights perspective. So for us, it's been also an effort to convince authorities and institutions about the importance of comply with the human rights legal framework and to include that in the programs of integration and employment, and even to promote like own businesses for migrants and refugees. And the last one is like the benefits of migration and the inclusion of this population in the labor market. So those like showing exact data and facts that shows the importance of include this labor force has been a very convinced argument for some actors and political actors at least in Colombia. So I will highlight these 3 points, like human rights perspective, integration, and highlighting the benefits of migration.
Thank you. They're really important points because there is a tendency in the narrative more generally to reduce migrants to sort of economic units of labor. What we don't want to do is, as you say, separate the issue of decent work and economic rights in the labor market, other rights in the labor market, from the whole human being and the rights that are associated with being a human being as opposed to a migrant. So I think that's a very helpful reminder of that. Paola, there was a question that was specifically directed, I guess, towards you, which was about really the role of trade unions in this issue of regularization of status, which seems to be so critical in terms of the rights-based approach to decent work. Reflections on that point? I know you did also mention it in your presentation.
Yeah, indeed. So I would like also to reiterate from our side that we should make all the effort to put in place, the changes in legislation where they are not really conducive to regularization. So as Michelle mentioned, the pushback approach doesn't really work, and therefore we should foster any legislation that is actually in line with regularization of migrant workers. And I think in there, it's key really, of course, to change the narrative. It was mentioned before the politics around it, and the political narrative is really key in this respect. And this what we are trying to do globally, for example, vis-a-vis, as it was mentioned, the Global Compact on Migration, and I have highlighted few weaknesses that are still there, unfortunately, but also to support our affiliates at national level, in putting forward a narrative that actually is in contrast with the fear approach that is usually used by, also far-right political parties that tend to demonize actually the position of migrant workers. And on the other hand, I would also like to recognize that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund itself, in a recent report that they published, they really, talking about the right narrative, they really underline how migrant workers actually can contribute to the economies of both their destination countries, but also on the countries of origin. So in that sense, also these arguments, I think they are also helpful in, in sketching the overall picture in this respect. And when it comes also to regularization, of course, the reality varies and changes from countries to countries, but for example, in my country of origin, in Italy, the unions are actually doing this, I would say, very inspiring engagement with refugees and asylum seekers in providing them professional training and helping them really to find a job concretely in with talking with employers and enterprises and with local authorities. So I mean, there is both of engagement on the politics, on the legislative level, and also on the collective bargaining level, where we can actually really contribute as trade unions to this. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, this point about narrative change, I think, is critical. It's certainly a very important theme of the work of the Migrant Hub, because it creates the context for different kinds of policy, right? Because it kind of in some way ameliorates some of the political challenges and opens up space for those interventions that are ultimately oriented towards delivering what people have signed up for, I guess. So I think we had two questions down here. If I'd ask you to introduce yourself very briefly at the beginning, and then I'll take both of those questions in turn. Thank you.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm Michael Stewart Evans from UN Women. Firstly, I'd like to thank UNU for hosting today's event, and to the speakers. It's been fascinating and really great food for thought for these discussions. I wanted to pick up on Daniel's question and also the responses just now regarding narratives. And we've also spoken a lot about policy coherence, and we seem to have a lot of answers in the room and in these sort of spaces around the importance of policy coherence. But one of the challenges I think we face is, how can we talk about policy coherence when there's no social coherence? And something that we need to address when we're thinking about narratives is, what does that actually look like for the average person when we're talking about regularization, access to decent work, when, and this was mentioned by Paola, the demonization of migrants continues at the political level. And when we're in these UN spaces and in our work, we have the policy answers. We've got the policy briefs, we've got the papers, we have these events, but that is not getting to the heart of the issue. And I think something from our side as well is, how do we reframe those discussions at the national level? Because we're often addressing migration from a development perspective, but what does that look like in terms of really challenging these narratives? And I certainly don't have the answers, and would love people to bring them to me. The other question I had is specific for Sarah. It's just on the point on the report that you mentioned. I wondered if the data that you have in the report is disaggregated by sex or by gender, and whether there are any different marked differences in the results related to wage theft. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to that question, but we'll take one more. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Good morning. My name is Kevin Cole. I'm from Refugee Solidarity Network. We're a small New York-based nonprofit. I had a question about the focus that we have here on regularization of individual migrants. I think something that we kind of oftentimes tend to forget when we're talking about, from a position that we live in with countries with large formalized economies, that one of the real core factors that inhibits access to rights, especially around labor, is the prevalence of informal economies. In most of the global South, informal economies actually make up perhaps even a larger share of the overall kind of economic activity in those countries. So to what extent do we need to start by expanding the formalization of labor itself? This means that natives, nationals of a country are sometimes, even if they're looked to be the protected class, set aside against an unprotected labor, migrant labor class. That's not necessarily the case. Oftentimes nationals themselves don't have access to formalized labor, and therefore the protections that are incumbent to participating in formalized labor. So I just wondered, to what extent is that a core area that we have to start working on before we look kind of to the formalization of individuals' status?
I mean, in some ways, I think your questions both speak to one another, don't you? Kind of, because I think this contextual point, and Sarah, you alluded to earlier on, the reality is that many individuals, including citizens, feel very marginalized. They feel that they haven't got rights and access to justice. They feel like they're being exploited. Zero-hour contracts in the European context is, a very pernicious situation of precarity for people who nominally have rights, but in reality feel unable to access them. So, and I think this thing about narratives, the demonization of migrants clearly is a sort of distraction from some of those things in a way, because it enables governments not to tackle some of the issues that are affecting everybody more generally. if you're aware, I'm sure you may well be, the Office for the High Commission for Human Rights, of course, has its hashtag Stand Up for Migrants campaign. But I think, and several people have said it also yourself, Daniel, that we can speak to ourselves in a room and we can have these conversations, but what's happening at the political level or in different contexts is really quite a different kind of conversation altogether, and it feels sometimes like a little bit of a bubble. But Sarah, I'll come back to you in a second about that specific question to you, but I wondered whether any of the panelists would like to come back on this issue of narratives, which we've touched on already, but this issue of narratives and how you create social coherence and solidarity between essentially groups in society who are kind of experiencing in some ways quite similar consequences of these shifts in the labour market, which are very marginalising. How do we create that solidarity and not have migrants sort of separated out and stigmatised in the way that's being described? Paola, you've got your mic off, so therefore you get the first shout, but it has to be short.
Sorry, I've just spoken. I was waiting for the others to take the floor. No, I mean, for us, of course, everything starts at the workplace, and therefore, I mean, of course, the organizing, what we call organizing, so outreaching to workers, no matter where they are, no matter where they work. Whether they are like in an informal, work or not, this is the answer. So this is what trade unions do, every day, and of course, this is we have actually within the individual affiliates at national level, but also as ITUC, as the global confederation. Specific also way of supporting our affiliates at national level in these organizing efforts. And we have the so-called the Global Organizing Academy, where we actually put at the disposal of our affiliates, our expertise, in order to increase the numbers of the affiliates, including migrant workers, but also to make our movement more inclusive. More inclusive, because we want migrant workers, including refugees, to see trade unions as their own place, their own house. So in that sense, the organizing for us is definitely the first response. And then also again on the narrative, the informal economy was mentioned, and I would like to recall that one of the pillars of the new social contract that we are calling on governments on is really formalization of the informal economy. And, we are calling for at least 1 billion informal jobs to be formalized. And then again, the ILO recommendation and instruments are at our help us very much. Michelle, I'm sure she will expand on that. We have, and I think it's very useful and important to mention that, because we have an orientation, a policy guidance, very concrete, that it was, endorsed by the UN, launched by the UN Secretary General, which is the accelerators on jobs, social protection, and just transitions, forged by also thanks to the involvement of the ILO and social partners in that sense, that paved the way concretely on the narrative. What should be the narrative? The narrative there, but then what should happen at national level, having these, 3 polar stars for the policy change and implementation at national level. So it's very important to policy piece indeed to push the narrative in the right way, in our view. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. Michelle, I wonder if I might come to you next. And Paola's suggestion, actually, but just building on that point in terms of, again, concretely this narrative point, I guess, which seems to be a very strong theme in the discussion.
Yes. Well, actually, I couldn't agree with Paola more. I mean, we see that when migrants are integrated into the workplace, there is much more solidarity. There's much more public perception, or the perception of co-workers about the vitality and the criticality of these workers, working side by side with them. There's more shared understanding, mutual respect. We've seen through surveys like Ipsos survey in Europe that people who have a very negative attitude about migrant workers are usually those who have never met a migrant worker. And where do you meet? Often your colleagues or friends in the workplace. So the workplace is absolutely critical to providing more integration into society. But of course, I share UN Women's perspective that, you know, how do we have a policy coherence without social coherence? And we really have to work on that. But I think the workplace is central. And one of the ways to do that is exactly what Paula said, organizing and bringing them into trade unions. I mean, that creates solidarity in the workplace and among families and networks that can help take away this negative perception that somehow migrants are coming to steal jobs or commit crimes and so on and so forth. So I do think we have a lot more that can be done there. I did want to reflect on the informal economy because ILO also sees this as a really important issue to accelerate. We've just adopted, as you know, we have a new Director General, Gilbert Rongbo, and we have adopted a new action program on informality. And what that is going to do is to bring the entire breadth of our field and headquarters together to really look at how we can improve attention to this, provide technical support to countries and stakeholders and communities where it's needed. But it definitely is an issue that has to be tackled. I might disagree just a little with having to do that before you actually tackle the issue of perceptions or before you actually tackle the issue of regularization. I think programs can be put into place right away in terms of regularization. And I hope some of you who are interested will take a look at the report that Thank You UNU just posted in the chat on regular and irregular migrant workers, and then the responses that have been done that are working that countries can adopt. And similarly, so I think with informality, you can work by implementing recommendation 204, which is ILO's recommendation on responses. And that could go a long way to trying to tackle the issues, you know, in parallel. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Michelle. Sarah, do you want to quickly come back in response to the specific question that was oriented at you, and then I'm going to come back to Lucia for the final word because she started us and she needs to end us.
Sure. A very quick answer because I didn't write the report, so I myself reading it. But and I will share it with you. Unfortunately, I'm not online. I put it into the chat, but it is a report from 2018 that is disaggregated. It has disaggregated data by nationality, by type of work visa, by type of profession that people were in terms of whether they could come forward. Australia has, I mean, for me, speaking from an American perspective, a fairly unique situation that their temporary migrant workers are largely students and international students. So a lot of them come from China and India, but also all over the world on very specific visas. And again, most of them are there with some forms of authorization in order to work, and yet are not being paid the minimum wage, yet we're working significantly longer hours than they were paid for, and still were afraid to come forward. One thing that's very clear in this report is that, you know, about 75% of the people who answered the survey didn't say, oh, we didn't know what our rights were, we didn't know we were making the minimum wage. They knew very well. I mean, migrant workers are extremely sophisticated, and also, you know, often thanks to the information that they're getting from unions and worker centers and colleagues, they have a lot of information about what the labor market is. So it isn't often the problem that they just had no idea what their rights were. But even knowing their rights, and even for people who were, you know, legally working in the country, there was still a lot of fear about what it meant to come forward in terms of their relationship with their employers, in terms of sort of cultural norms against coming forward, but also because some people might have been working longer than they were technically allowed to and weren't sure what the repercussions were going to be. I think all of those things, and again, I feel like that's a situation where people are in a relatively privileged situation about coming forward. You know, we're not even talking about refugees or asylum seekers who literally can't leave their country, and what can they do? Of course, you're going to take, you know, the whatever pay you can get, because that seems like a more stable, concrete path than walking towards nothingness. But even with all of that information, it's still not necessarily enough for people to be able to activate their rights without that stronger political commitment and support.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Lucia, we're very grateful for you, first of all, for sort of triggering this conversation by virtue of the book, and We will again in the policy brief share the link to the book and also to any of the other publications that have been suggested. And Sarah, you can also send that to us for inclusion. Najib, would you like to just very briefly perhaps just conclude by any final remarks you'd like to make in response to the conversation we've had today?
Yes, yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about the issue of narratives and also like informal economy. So regarding the narratives, I would like to share some experiences that we have had here in Colombia, which is the case that I know the better. So first, it was acknowledging that these narratives are based on an issue of xenophobia. And this was very important for us because we are very similar, like Venezuela and Colombia are very similar. We share like the culture, like physical characteristics. And for us, it was very important to take that first step, like a society recognize that there are issues of xenophobia, and that impacts the relationship between the migrants and refugees and the local communities, and of course the labor market. So in research that we did, also studying deeper the case of Colombia, we found that in the selection process, there is bias against migrants and refugees based on these xenophobia discourses. So we identified there are two actions that civil society can take. One is to promote the education of the media and the media outlets, because they are the main channel while these narratives are spread. So there has been a lot of efforts to educate media outlets about how to provide communication that is respectful of migrants and refugees and don't reinforce these stigmas about criminalization or other behaviors. And the second one is working with the local community. So for example, there are interventions that at the beginning were only focused on migrants and refugees, but very quickly civil society organizations, international agencies realized the importance of working with the local communities, the recipient communities as a whole, not only with migrants and refugees, because that can lower the tensions that are between these communities and the issues of xenophobia and competing with few resources. And finally, regarding the informal economy, I just wanted to say that, for example, here we have a context where we have higher unemployment rates, but also a growing informal economy. And there are few people that can really enjoy all the rights of being like a formal worker. So the importance of bringing these issues to the discussion of like a general labor reform is important, at least here, like in Colombia, but I think this is an issue that can be replicated in other global South countries. This is not only discussion about how to guarantee the rights of migrants and refugees, but also how to reform the labor market in order to respond to the needs of all workers, as like Paula and Michelle were saying before. So I wanted to thank you all for the opportunity for this discussion, and looking forward to other spaces like this.
Thank you all very much. And unfortunately, we have run out of time, but we are, wanting to continue this conversation. This is just in a way of bringing together different agencies around and different parties around some of these issues, but this is kind of not the end of the story. I know Lucia and I are going to produce something together, and we hope to continue the conversation around some of these issues. Really grateful to all the speakers. I think we should give them a round of applause to show their appreciation. Really wanted to thank the team at UNU-CPR for all their work, especially today, actually, in making the event very successful. So in particular to Raphael Bodwig, Jack, Daryl, Vanessa Pius, and Lauren McGowan, who was sorting out the videos. Thank you so much for everything. And we're really grateful to the Baha'i International Community, the UN, for these fantastic facilities. It's a really pleasure to be in this environment and have the chance to move the camera around the room. It's quite a luxury. Thank you to you, of course, for your engagement and for your contributions. As mentioned earlier, we'll be producing a policy brief summarizing the key themes. I think there's some very clear ones around regularization, around narratives, around building connection between migrant workers and all workers around the kind of shared injustices that they face in the labour market and more generally, perhaps. And we will have future roundtables. I'm hoping, in fact, we might have one next with Jinho around issues of climate mobility. So we'll keep you informed about that and hope to see you again at a future event. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, Michelle. Bye.
Bye. Have a good day. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye. Bye, Heaven.
Bye, Paula.
Keep in touch.
Bye.
Ciao.
Yeah, for sure.